Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session today. We are talking about school selection and which schools to apply. Things have been calmed down a little bit. Yesterday, we did a live session on online GMAT and everything about it. It was a really cool session because we had over 530 people watching live. So now this 32 people watching live is like a weird situation for me. Now I want to go back to so many people watching. But anyway, I'm Shovik. I'm a second year student at the Michigan Ross School of Business. I'm here with Sam. Sam, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself again?
Hey, everybody. I'm Sam, second year student at Michigan Ross, hopefully still going to Microsoft full time, and looking forward to sharing with you.
Awesome. So Sam, my main reason of doing this video is like a prelude to tomorrow's video where we are going to look at a few profiles on GMAT Club and speculate on their questions and their chances. So,
Awesome.
so I wanted to do a video before that on the specific strategy or the specific reasons why people pick certain schools over others, and then maybe we can get some learning about what are some of the things that you can follow or that you can do when you are picking schools. So I want to start with you. You applied to a bunch of schools. How did you pick those specific schools? I think you did a lot of Booth, Ross, and all of those schools. Can you tell me a little bit more about your rationale of applying to them?
Yeah, I applied to most of the schools in that kind of top 12 quadrant. Really want to stick with the ratings because that's kind of what I knew at the time, but also looking at those employment reports from some of those schools, seeing which ones kind of favored tech, which is what I wanted to do, and also the West Coast. But if I had to go back and do it again, I would have gotten more granular and nuanced for sure, because those ratings and those employment reports, they only tell you so much. They don't tell you those little details of what you'll actually experience when you kind of are on campus.
So let's start with tech. You mentioned that you wanted to do tech, and by the way, people who are
experience when you kind of are on campus.
Sorry about that echo a little bit. So for people who are already online, feel free to ask questions around schools and employment and which industry and whatever. But let's start with tech. So you mentioned that you wanted to do tech, and you were picking schools that were higher in rankings and were in the West Coast. And so how did you go about that research? What did you do? And you mentioned something before the video of not solely relying on rankings or not solely relying on employment reports. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was really interested in all the different companies that, these different schools sent people to, especially in tech. So I was looking for kind of that breadth, because you don't know which company you'll end up with before you get there.
Right.
But after I started talking to people that were in MBA currently, you kind of got to lay the land where for tech, it's a limited number of companies that come on, and it's to campus across the board usually. It's usually most of the big ones for schools that are not sitting in San Francisco's backyard.
Right.
So you want to get to really know that, which are those schools, how heavy do they come to your certain school that you're looking at? And then you want to do the off-campus stuff. What are the schools that have created, the students in the past have created this kind of pipeline to these off-campus schools? And so the Michigan is a good example of a school like for us that it's not as highly ranked as Booth or Kellogg, but it's pretty strong in tech, not only because of the companies that come on campus and they really like Michigan, but a lot of rosters have created some solid pipelines into other tech companies in Seattle and San Francisco because of their hard work.
Right. And so for example, I'm just going to try to be specific. Michigan has a very strong network in both Amazon and Microsoft, the two biggest tech MBA employers. So I think that definitely helped us. But I was actually surprised that how strong the Michigan network is, even in places like Google,
Yeah.
Even Facebook and Apple. I found a lot of people. Again, I think different schools have different pipelines. So I think it's important to go to a school where you have sort of established some of that pipelines into the companies that you are hoping to recruit into.
And
Um,
you're
yeah, go
you're
ahead.
yeah, you're just not going to know that pipeline or the strength of it from looking at employment reports and rankings. You're going to
Right,
know by talking to students, maybe getting actual numbers. But any current student that's going through that recruiting process for that industry will have
right.
we'll be able to give you the sense of how strong any pipeline is with a company.
Got it. So, can you tell me a little bit more about, apart from Michigan, some of your rationale for applying to any other school and what pipeline were you really looking at? Like, I understand
Yeah,
Michigan because you're looking at Amazon and Microsoft. I get that.
yeah.
What about some of the other schools in your selection?
Yeah, like I think Berkeley or Haas was a good example of it's just right there in the backyard of all the tech companies. It's not only highly rated, but you have a smaller class. And so maybe potentially less competition going
Right,
for all those companies. Michigan does strong with tech, but Michigan is probably not going to do as strong with tech in the Bay Area as
right.
Berkeley, you know, and then so, and you find that out. You find out that companies like Adobe and Salesforce are a good example. They're only now starting to come on campus for Michigan, whereas they've been an on-campus companies for Haas for a long time.
Yeah. And I think Salesforce is what was one of the companies where I felt Michigan maybe did not have as strong of a network as I thought it would. But I realized that Salesforce is and again, don't quote me on this. This is just my anecdotal observations. I felt that Salesforce has its own network of schools, and they are very close knit and stuff like that. Okay, so I think one other tech company that I want to talk a little bit about is Walmart e-commerce,
Yeah.
and I felt that when I was recruiting for full time, I felt Walmart e-commerce was one of the schools where I hit a brick wall because they would. I got tons of referrals. I talked to tons of people, and there were some Michigan rosters, right? But on-campus recruiting was very different because they clearly just went to the schools that were within their target and within their closed list of some weird kind. And it's the same for Apple. When I spent my summer at Apple, I was hoping to see more Michigan people because they hired me and someone else from Michigan. So I thought maybe Michigan's in their radar. And I spoke to the recruiter and I asked her, "Hey, like, why don't you come to campus in Michigan?" And she was pretty flat out and like they have to optimize for regional schools and they can only go to so many schools, and it's going to be unlikely that they're going to change that any time in the near future, which was disappointing, but it sort of helped me understand how sort of these networks work within tech recruiting. Okay,
Yeah.
jumping more around other industries as well, consulting. I recruited for consulting, and you did a little bit too. So,
Yeah.
just so that everybody knows, I pushed Sam to recruit for consulting because I thought he'd be a really good fit, and he was very successful. He got to a lot of different companies and final rounds and such. So that was nice. So they saw. Let's talk a little bit about consulting. Let's say you want to go to business school and you're looking at the top 10, 12, 15 business schools, and you want to get into consulting. What options do you have? Which school should you even pick?
Yeah. I mean, I think that from what I experienced, you have kind of the top layer of consulting in people's minds, the MBB companies. And
Sure.
so there's schools that have a stronger pull with them, potentially because of ranking, history, but also maybe they're regionally closer to the headquarter office or where
Right.
the recruiting office. But then you have that second layer, which is in people's minds. I don't think it's a second layer, of quality, which will come heavy at a school like Michigan and recruit really heavy. And so I think it's about with them, consulting's more standardized, more formulaic, their recruiting. So with them,
Yeah.
I think it's about really digging into the numbers from each year and kind of seeing those trends. And also for international students, kind of touching base with international students currently recruiting for consulting and seeing what the numbers are within each company is there.
Right. And I think that's a good measure. And I felt that I saw this one post on GMAT Club, which sort of prompted a little bit of this video, was somebody was comparing between, I think, Darden. Again, I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember this thread electronically. But somebody was comparing Darden and I think a slightly lower ranked school that I cannot remember right now, and they were saying I want to go to Texas, and so from Darden I found three people going to Texas for MBB, and for this other school I found like four people going to Texas and MBB. So is this other school which is lower ranked than Darden? Is that a better option for me? And I was rejecting this hypothesis because like you may have, let's say you take a top 10 school and you may have let's say 10 people going to MBB from that school, for example, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean just because another school also had 10 people, they're in the same footing when it comes to MBB. How generally consulting recruiting works, especially for MBB, is as the school's relationship is closer and as the school views that, as the firm views that school as one of their targets, their pool becomes bigger.
Yep.
So, like for example, if you are at Ross versus if you are at, let's say, Michigan State, another school within, I think they're called Broad School of Business, if I'm not wrong. So it's a much lower ranked school, right? So Bain, for example, which is very strong with Michigan, Bain would just close list and ask to interview around 100 people from Michigan, like 25% of the whole class. And in Broad, in Michigan State, they would barely do one third of that. So, and eventually, then that's the number that you want to look at, because that sort of tells you how much access you have to this consulting firm and how much work do you have to put in to actually get your foot in the door. After that initial closed list process, it really doesn't matter which school you're from, because you're going to be evaluated very independently. The alumni from different schools will interview you. When I interviewed for Bain, BCG, McKinsey, I didn't really have a single person in my final round who also went to Ross, and I think that is by design. So yeah. So anyway, this is a long-winded way to say that you need to look at the number of people who interviewed, not number of people who got selected. So other ways of recruiting consulting, I just wanted to get this out there. A lot of schools are good in consulting. All the top 10, top 15 schools, they're all good. Like they will all open consulting doors for you, and all consulting firms would go there. I think the bigger question to ask is this the kind of consulting you want to do? Like, for example, if you want to get into Texas, that like my previous example, can you get that done from Berkeley, like a Haas School of Business? Maybe, but your chances will probably be a lot more if you went to Darden or if you went to Fuqua, which are closer, but also they have bigger networks in those offices. So you can tap into the Fuqua network to find Fuqua alums who are working in these Texas offices to vouch for you and to get you that interview. Um, awesome. So the other question that I had around this whole recruitment and industry thing was finance. So a lot of people get into business school to get into finance, and finance, we have spoken about this before in our videos, that finance can be really, really challenging. It could be investment banking, it could be wealth management, it could be corporate finance. So it really can be anything. So
Yep.
Sam, what are your thoughts on finance recruiting and selecting schools based on your finance goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first question is you got to ask yourself which finance or which types of finance. Um, I think if it's going to be like Wall Street finance, investment banking, obviously being at schools in the Northeast give you
Right.
that really close proximity, and that proximity is going to lead to a stronger pipeline. However, like a school like
Right.
Michigan, where we went, not geographically close at all.
Yeah.
Less people from there go to finance and investment banking in New York. However, because you have less people competing for that at Michigan
Yeah,
Ross, I was told, and from what I could vouch based on what numbers I heard, that, you know, if you go through the process and you prepare, you got a pretty decent chance at getting what you want,
right.
um, because there's a bit less competition. I think that works with recruiting processes that are really delineated and really laid out and standardized, like investment banking, like consulting. I think it's
Right.
a bit less so with tech because it's not as standardized, but with those things, I think that can be absolutely true.
Awesome. So, and that also makes sense because I felt like if you want to get into corporate finance, and this is a controversial statement I'm trying to make. I think if you want to get into corporate finance, which a lot of people do, I think it's better for you if you go to a school that's very strong in general management.
Yep.
Because a lot of these companies that will hire for general management will come to campus for strategy roles, marketing roles, and finance roles.
Yeah.
So invariably, you would probably be in a better position. I would say though, like if you want to get into investment banking or banks in general, I think it's hyper geography specific, and
Yep.
I think one example that comes to my mind is that more people get into investment banking from Stern, which is like a top 10, top 12, top 15 school, than from like the top 5 school like Sloan. So I would say, like if you want to get into investment banking, you want to stay close to New York, and if that's your primary goal, I think being close to New York helps.
And
So those. Sorry, Sam. Go ahead.
yeah, just the geography opens you up not just to the big names, because the big names will probably come to most of the top 10 schools. It's just a
Right.
matter of what the numbers are. But geography opens you up to the smaller places in that location. So there are investment banks, or there are private equity firms, venture capital firms, and tech firms in
Right.
Ann Arbor, Detroit, that are great companies. They're just nobody knows of them, and so being in Ann Arbor at Michigan opens you up to that. But I'm sure there's even more in New York, that
Yeah.
being in a New York or Northeast school will get you access to that. Whereas if you're at Michigan, you're not going to have much access to those kind of companies.
That makes sense. And I think one other thing that I'd just like to quickly touch on is the competition thing that you mentioned. So when I was applying to business school, one of my friends just finished her first year at Tuck, and she was telling me about Tuck. And I wanted to get into tech, and I definitely was sure that a company like Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon would be on my list. So Tuck, and this friend from Tuck was telling me that, look, if you want to get into Amazon, Tuck is probably a better school. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like the numbers for Ross are so much higher. And she was like, yeah, that may be true in the same way that Tuck is purely a very consulting heavy school. So of the 350 people in the class, about 320 of them want to get into consulting. So the competition to get into consulting is also extremely high because in the first round, you are competing with your fellow classmates for that closed list spot and for that interview. However, not a lot of people in tech want to do tech. So she was trying to play this game, which I think seemed very logical then, and it does seem very logical now too. So lots of Tuckies went to Amazon. So I was like, that's a good strategy. Awesome. So I want to start taking questions. We have about 10 minutes left. So we're getting a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to get some. Average GMAT scores are generally a good barometer for students to pick colleges. Indian students tend to score around 20 points over the GMAT. How does this work for Canada with the GRE? Um, uh, we are looking at recruitment today. So recruitment-wise, to be honest, your GMAT, GRE scores really don't matter. Like unless you have there's a lot of rumors when we first applied to schools, like, oh, for consulting, you really need to have a high GMAT score. And I realized that some of that is not true. And I think lots of my friends got consulting offers with a 700 GMAT, with a 690 GMAT. It happens all the time. And a ton of 760, 770 people get outright rejected. Can it help you? Sure. But will it help you? I don't know. And for the GRE, it's the same thing. GRE also has percentiles. It's very easy to say which is a good GRE score and which is not. So I don't see it to be any different just because the nature of the test is different. Sam, do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, I agree. I think, especially with consulting, heavy networking is important. Having a personality and really matching the way you go about things with that company and casing. I think those are the more important things than your GMAT score.
Right. Question around, what are the schools that come to your mind for marketing a CPG? Kellogg. Kellogg is the biggest CPG school ever, but also Kellogg is really hard to get into. So pick Ross if you didn't get into Kellogg. Ross is pretty strong on CPG. Lots of companies come to campus, and General Mills being one of them, like one of the big recruiters. But we also have things like Kraft Heinz and a lot of smaller CPG companies as well. So Kellogg is a big thing as well. Sam, do you have any other school recommendation other than Ross and Kellogg?
I think NYU for marketing, so Stern. And I think like a UNC, an Emory. Walmart is a huge employer of kids for us, students from Michigan, UNC, Emory,
Right.
and that's king of CPG. So those are kind of the schools that come to mind.
Also, just want to send a quick note. The entire CPG industry is changing very rapidly, so I wouldn't really think of brand management as the only path to CPG. Well, you could be in the retail program at Amazon and know more than most CPG people ever will. Again, don't quote me, that's just my opinion, but I think you should explore more opportunities that are closer to consumer packaged goods retail. All right, questions. How would you compare INSEAD with other US schools with similar rankings? I have some thought. I think it is a great school. I think it's one of the best schools in the world. It's a consulting powerhouse. Like, they work so hard to get you consulting opportunities. So I think if you want to do consulting, general management, finance, I think INSEAD is like probably one of the best schools you can get into. However, having said that, you will probably be limited to opportunities within Europe. It's common for INSEAD graduates to come to the US for their full-time jobs, but it's not the norm. So you may have to work slightly harder if you want to switch and come back to the US. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, agreed. I think if you can get that smaller chance to come to America from that, it's probably going to be in New York. Not necessarily you're not going to necessarily have the access to cities like Seattle, Chicago, the little smaller places.
Right.
But maybe the Middle East opens up for you in INSEAD or
Oh,
Asia.
yeah.
If that's.
I was surprised to see how many consulting firms recruit for their Middle East offices in Ross. So maybe it will open for you. Okay, so schools which are great for operations management. So I think Ross is one of the biggest names in operations. We have a special school called the Tauber Institute for Ops, and one of the reasons Amazon hires a lot from Ross is because ops is so big here. But for other schools that come to mind, I think McCombs is really good. I think Emory has a strong name in ops. Sam, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, we're not getting paid by Ross for this, just off the top. Is Tepper good? And Tepper kind of comes to mind.
Tepper is really good, especially for ops and engineering fields
Yeah.
and tech. So a lot of these ops roles, I think just like everything else, tech has taken over the whole ops and ops recruiting. Amazon, Microsoft, they have giant operation recruiting happening, and I think any sort of company that is a target school for those recruitment areas, you'll get good opportunities. Apple is one of probably, I think Apple operations people make the most money among all other operations people. Apple has a really strong operations program as well. And
I think in that kind of top, like M7 schools, probably MIT stands out to me if I were top of mind.
Right. So for these kind of operations roles, you want to be at the top schools. I think Kellogg, MIT. To get into Apple operations, I think it's going to be harder if you're not in a top school. All right. So more questions coming in. For candidates who come from a totally diverse non-corporate background, what should be the criteria for school selections, particularly in terms of electives and core? I don't think electives and core matter, man. I mean, I think they're the same in all schools, and I think what matters a lot more is recruiting and what you want to do after business school. So I think that is a significantly better criteria. One thing that I did not mention yet, and I definitely wanted to do within this video, is you not only need to go to a school where you are likely to get a job that you want, you also need to go to a school where you're likely to get your second preferred job if you don't get your first one. So a plan B is extremely important for business school. Most people don't have their plan A worked out, right? So plan B is super important. I wouldn't even call it plan B. I would just call it plan A.1 or something. So it's super important to go to a school that not for example, for most international, it's consulting in tech. So plan A consulting, plan B tech, or plan A tech, plan B consulting. So you need to go to a school that gives you both of these opportunities, right? So otherwise you're going to do a massive disservice that, oh, you just came here and you couldn't get what you wanted, and now you have no other option. Okay, question. Let's see. Sam, this is for you. Should people with 2-3 years of experiences go for MBA?
If you can get in, yeah. I don't think, I mean, if you can get in, yes. I mean, you're going to want to show off that experience because it's going to come up in all the interviews.
Yeah.
So if it's strong and in-depth experience, because the other thing is 2-3 years, you could have had a full-time job that was really strong. You could have done nonprofit work and been leadership there. That's pretty strong. So there could be 6 years jammed in that 2 to 3 years.
Right.
So yeah, if you can get in and it's rich experiences, I would go for it. If this is what you want to do.
Yeah, and I also think a lot of average ages in a lot of schools have come down a little bit. So I think the average age at Harvard right now is 26, which is pretty low, 25. So that makes sense. So which school is the best for media, entertainment, and communication? Most schools in LA would give you that. LA is the place, and I think a little bit in New York too. So, for example, if you go to LA, you have all these like Hollywood studios, media productions, game studios, and all of that. In New York, you have those things, but you also have a lot of tech entertainment companies, things like Spotify and all of that stuff. So, I think both the costs are great, but I would warn you, they don't pay very much. Most media entertainment companies are notorious for paying very, very low. So, yeah, take your call. Sam, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think West Coast, UCLA, USC, strong in that. East Coast, NYU, probably Columbia, strong as well.
So I would appreciate if you could throw some light on 1-year MBA from Johnson. Which sector is the school's forte? So Johnson is the Cornell's business school. I think Johnson, the 2-year program, is okay. It's not my favorite, but I would say a program at an equivalent school, places like Stern, McCombs, UCLA are probably better. I like those schools more, and they are much better located. Johnson is in the middle of nowhere. And the other thing about Johnson, you mentioned the 1-year program. I'm not a big fan of 1-year program. I would say the only reason of going to a 1-year program is if you are either super old and you don't want to spend 2 years. The opportunity cost is just way too high. Or you are very, very clear on what you want to do. So unless those two things happen, I wouldn't recommend a 1-year program, but it's still better than anything not doing an MBA. So in terms of what's the school's forte, I met people in Johnson in a lot of tech companies. I met them in Amazon, met them in Apple, but fewer in numbers, to be honest. And I think Johnson has consulting companies coming to campus and recruiting as well. So that can also be an opportunity for you. Sam, what are your thoughts on Johnson?
Yeah, I think finance, investment banking, stuff in New York, maybe a little media, but they do have a decent representation in big tech companies like Amazon, Microsoft, a little Google. But just, I think you hit it right on that, just little less numbers for those companies.
Awesome. So I think we are sort of out of time now. So I'm just gonna check if I get a pressing question. Okay, USC Marshall. USC Marshall has been a school on the rise. So how does USC Marshall compare to other schools for consulting and tech? You have to talk about which schools. Are you comparing USC Marshall to Harvard Business School, or are you comparing USC Marshall to an equivalent school like a Foster or an Emory? I think USC is a great school. I think they're only getting better, and I think for in terms of consulting and tech opportunities, I think it will be better if not the same. Um, but in terms of location, I think a lot of that will be restricted to the Southern California and generally California and the West Coast. So I would say if you want to recruit in New York, USC may not be the best option for you. So, but I'm curious to know or see what you think, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, I think with every school, outside of like maybe Stanford and Harvard and the top tools, like it all depends. It all depends on what kind of company you want to go to, what area you want to be in. And there's going to be these hidden pipelines that we talked about that you're not going to know until you actually talk to students there. So it all really depends. I mean, this idea that it's got to be top 5 or bust is a myth, in my
very
opinion.
stupid too. It's also, sorry, Sam, I didn't mean to cut you off. This whole idea of top 5 or bust comes from this really strange entitlement within you. So get rid of that idea. And trust me, when you get rejected from all these top 5 schools in round one, those top 10, top 15 schools will start looking a whole lot better in round
Yeah,
two.
I mean, like through my journey, I got into Ross and got waitlisted at Booth and then got kind of denied at some of the other Booth-like schools. At the moment, at that first time, I felt good I was into Ross, but Ross was kind of like my last option in that list. I felt bad that I didn't get into the top thing. Going through the process, learning more about Ross constantly, and then being on the other side of it, Ross was absolutely good enough for what I wanted and for most, if not all, of what my peers wanted. Very strong school. And the same with USC, the same with Tepper, with Emory. Those are schools that they don't jump out because they're not in the top 5 rankings, but their career services are awesome, and specifically with their really familiar industries with them, they're awesome schools.
All right, great. So again, we're going to close today. Remember, we're doing a similar session tomorrow, the part 2 of this. We're going to take profiles from GMAT Club for people who are looking to ask other people, hey, like which school can I get into? So join us for that. We're going to have some fun. We're going to speculate on other people's misery. So that's always fun. So John, it's on the same time, 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for joining. I'll see you tomorrow.
We'll see everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks, Sam.